At my brother's campaign dinner, my father stood up with a glass of sweet tea in his hand and implied that I had only come back to town because my mother's death had finally made our family useful to me. Half the room agreed with him before he said my name. That was the real problem. Not his words. The speed with which they fit the story everyone was already comfortable hearing. We were in the fellowship hall of First Baptist in Halcyon, Arkansas, a narrow river town where people still measured trust by who sat where on Sundays and who stayed after funerals to fold tablecloths. The dinner had been arranged as a community kickoff for my younger brother, Caleb Mercer, who was running for the county school board. There were paper lanterns over the long buffet tables, campaign cards by the coffee urn, and a banner near the stage that read, "Stronger Schools." Stronger County in blue block letters that looked more expensive than anything my brother had ever paid for by himself. The room smelled like baked chicken, floor wax, and iced tea melting too fast in styrofoam cups. At the front, near the portable podium, someone had set up a photo display of my mother, June Mercer, smiling beside children from the after-school reading program she had started 14 years earlier in the back room of the public library. In one photo, she was crouched beside a first grader holding up a paper star. In another, she stood on the library steps with volunteers and cardboard boxes full of donated books. Behind those pictures, almost as an afterthought, was a campaign sign with Caleb's name printed larger than anything else in the room. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked in. Not the sign itself. The proportion. My mother's work had become his backdrop. I had been back in town less than 12 minutes when my father rose to thank the people who stayed faithful to this family when things got hard. He was 71 and still wore authority the way some men wear jackets out of habit, not because the weather called for it. He did not sound angry. Men like my father rarely do when they are being most effective. They sound disappointed, burdened, almost generous. He thanked the churchwomen. He thanked the donors. He thanked those who kept June's vision alive in the community. Then he took a slow sip of tea, looked toward my table, and said, "And I suppose we should also welcome people who only come home when there's an audience." A few people laughed softly because they thought they were supposed to. Then he said my name. Nora's always had a gift for timing. No one gasped. In towns like mine, public humiliation does not usually arrive as shock. It arrives as confirmation. The room had already been prepared for that sentence in smaller, quieter places in the parking lot after church, in checkout lines, in side conversations after my mother died. Nora lives in Nashville now. Nora never really fit here. Nora gets emotional about the program. Nora thinks because she writes checks, she understands what the town needs. That was the version of me waiting in that room before I got there. My name is Nora Mercer. I was 37 that spring, and by then most people in Halcyon believed they knew exactly what kind of woman I had become. Too polished, too far away, too opinionated. The daughter who left for the city and came back whenever there was a microphone nearby. If my father had said I was selfish, it would have sounded too crude. If he had called me dishonest, he would have had to prove something. But by suggesting timing, attention, appearance, he could let the room do the uglier work for him. People in family systems like mine prefer implication. It leaves them feeling decent. I did not stand immediately. That mattered. Quick movement would have looked reactive. The people in that room had known me since I was a teenager. They had watched me argue in school board meetings about library cuts, leave town on a scholarship, come home for holidays less often than my mother wanted, and send money home without talking about it. They already had a category for my emotions, and I had no intention of stepping neatly into it for them. So I stayed seated at the end of a round table near the dessert trays and let the sentence hang where he had placed it. Across the room, Caleb looked down at his plate. That told me more than my father's speech did. If this had truly surprised him, he would have lifted his head. He would have winced, or looked embarrassed, or tried to soften it somehow. Instead, he cut a piece of cornbread into smaller and smaller squares with the edge of his fork and let our father define the room for both of us. The campaign committee chair, a local dentist's wife named Marcia Wynne, shifted the stack of pledge cards near the podium, as if paper alignment still counted as neutral behavior in moments like that. A retired principal I recognized from my middle school years stared into her coffee. Two women from the literacy board, the same board my mother had built from scratch, and I had quietly kept solvent twice in the past 3 years, looked at me with the expression people wear when they do not know whether to offer sympathy or distance. No one interrupted. That was when I knew the dinner had not simply gone wrong. The room had been arranged. Not formally, not with some explicit plan I could point to and expose, but arranged all the same. My father's sentence had too much confidence behind it. The banner, the photo display, the donor cards, the local pastor opening the night with a prayer about legacy and continuity. Everything had been designed to make Caleb's campaign feel like the natural extension of my mother's work, and me feel like the difficult complication arriving from outside the county line. What no one in that room knew, not my father, not Caleb, not the women on the board, not the people already deciding whether my expression looked defensive, was that my mother had anticipated exactly this kind of conversion before she died. She had not called it theft. She had called it drift. And 2 months before the cancer took her, she had placed a sealed packet in the custody of a person my father could not pressure, charm, or outtalk. I did not know yet whether that packet had made it to Halcyon. I only knew that when my father lifted his glass again and smiled like a man who had just turned a room his direction, the library's retired treasurer stood from the second row with a gray binder in her hands and asked, in the quietest voice of the night, whether this might be the right time to read June Mercer's final board instruction. That was the moment the room stopped belonging entirely to my family, and it was the moment my brother finally looked up. If you had asked my family whether they respected me, every one of them would have said yes. That was the first lie they learned to tell in a tone gentle enough to pass for truth. Respect, in our house, never meant being believed first. It never meant your judgment counted equally. It meant you were spoken about well enough in public that no one could accuse the family of open cruelty. Everything else was negotiable. My mother used to say that every child in a family has a different way of being loved. That sounded wise when she said it. It even sounded generous. But what it meant in practice was that some children were understood in ways that made life easier, while others were expected to survive misreading and call that maturity. My brother Caleb was easy to understand. I was not. Caleb had the gifts small towns reward early. He was warm, broad-shouldered, good at names, and instinctively aware of how people liked to feel when he spoke to them. He could ask about a cousin's knee surgery, remember a banker's anniversary, and compliment a deacon on a sermon he had barely listened to, all within 10 minutes. He was not fake, exactly. He simply understood that social life ran on lubrication, and he never saw much value in friction. I was different, even as a child. I wanted specifics. I asked follow-up questions. I remembered who said what, and then noticed when the same people denied it later. If my father promised to fix something Saturday, I remembered when Saturday passed. If the church library lost 3 boxes of donated books, I wanted to know where they had gone. If the adults praised community values while cutting summer reading hours because volunteers were tired, I asked why the children who needed the program most were the ones expected to absorb the loss quietly. That kind of mind does not grow popular in places that depend on soft omissions. At 13, I organized the middle school book drive and kept a handwritten inventory because the principal had a habit of announcing totals that sounded better than the actual count. My father called it a little much. Caleb called it classic Nora, smiling when he said it so the room would laugh with him instead of at me. My mother pressed my shoulder and told me I had such a serious heart, which in our family was the phrase used whenever someone wanted to admire your intention while dismissing your methods. At 15, I helped my mother set up folding tables for the first summer session of the reading program she started in the back room of Halcyon Public Library. There were donated beanbag chairs, plastic bins full of books, juice boxes sweating in coolers, and 6 children who had nothing much to do in June except wander between the library and the Dollar General parking lot. My mother was in her element. She moved through the room with a clipboard and a smile, making everyone feel chosen. Caleb arrived 40 minutes late, carried in the last 2 boxes, made 3 toddlers laugh, and left with half the room calling him such a good boy. I stayed until closing, counted leftover supplies, tallied sign-in sheets, wiped marker from the folding tables. No one called me a good girl. They called me dependable, which in women is often just admiration stripped of warmth. My father was not a dramatic man. That was part of what made him effective. He believed that if he rarely raised his voice, people would call him fair. Most of the time they did. He ran a hardware store for 30 years and spoke in the slow, settled tone of men who assume their opinions should carry the weight of common sense. If he said I was too eager to make things official, it sounded like a reasonable observation rather than what it actually was. Impatience with a daughter who kept trying to pin reality down before it could be conveniently restated. My mother, June, was the opposite kind of force. She did not dominate rooms. She warmed them. She was beautiful in the way certain women become beautiful after 40 through purpose, not fragility. She started the reading program because she was tired of seeing children from the trailer park north of Route 18 drift through summer without books, structure, or anyone checking whether they had slipped behind in school. She was not sentimental about poverty. She was organized, persistent, and sharp enough to know that charity without records becomes vanity in under a year. That was where she and I understood each other best. Not through temperament, through structure. My mother loved people easily. I trusted systems slowly. Together, that worked. Until she got sick. But before any of that, there was the simpler problem of who our family trusted to represent itself. Caleb was their version of continuity. He stayed in Halcyon, married young, coached Little League, joined the church board before 30. He had exactly the kind of adulthood that made older people speak about him with relieved affection. He looked like proof that nothing essential had been lost. I left. Not dramatically. I won a scholarship, went to college in Memphis, then built a career in nonprofit program development in Nashville. My work was steady and useful and nearly invisible to the people back home because it lived in grants, donor reports, staffing models, emergency budget patches, and the 1,000 small systems that keep good intentions from collapsing the minute someone gets tired. To Halcyon, that made me legible only in fragments. Nora works with foundations now. Nora writes proposals. Nora's always been smart. Nora never did come back for good. That last sentence carried more judgment than the others. In towns like mine, returning is treated as proof of virtue, even when leaving is the only reason some daughters get to become themselves. By the time my mother died, the family had already had years of practice translating me. Organized became controlling. Accurate became cold. Committed became too much. So when my father hinted at the campaign dinner that I had come back for attention, he wasn't inventing a role for me out of nowhere. He was activating one that had been waiting for years. What he did not account for was that my mother had spent just as many years watching how the family assigned trust, and she had quietly decided that if the program was ever used as a family asset instead of a public promise, her records would need better protection than our last name. My mother started the reading program in the library basement with 12 paperback books, 2 folding tables, and a borrowed box of crayons. That was the official version she told at donor luncheons and church breakfasts, and it was mostly true. What she usually left out was the part where she also spent the first 3 summers absorbing every small humiliation that comes with asking a town to care consistently about children who do not improve anyone's property values. She was good at that kind of work in a way I never was. My mother could make people feel useful before they had earned it. She could get the florist's wife to donate snacks, the retired principal to read on Tuesdays, and the woman who complained loudest about other people's children to sort books in the back room once a month because June Mercer knew exactly how to flatter pride into cooperation. I did not inherit that gift. What I inherited instead was her willingness to build structure beneath goodwill so the whole thing would not collapse, the minute attention drifted elsewhere. By the time I was 20, the reading program had expanded into a registered nonprofit with a 3-person volunteer board, a tiny annual fundraiser, and enough donated books to justify a real catalog system. My mother did the public side. I built spreadsheets on my college laptop and cleaned up grant language she didn't have time to finish. Caleb came in when cameras or local paper coverage were likely. He carried boxes, smiled well, and got described as June's right hand by people who had never once seen him balance the budget when donations came in thin. That was not his fault entirely. Public life has always favored the visible half of the labor. Still, even then, I noticed how easily the family let his occasional presence become mythology, while my steady work was treated like an extension of personality. Nora likes that kind of thing. Nora's good with details. Nora doesn't mind. The same effort from a son became proof of character. From a daughter, it became temperament. My father praised the program endlessly in public once it started winning local goodwill. What he praised, however, was not the work. It was what the work reflected back on the family. At church, he would say, June has always had a heart for children, which was true, and then add, we've all pitched in, which was true only if one defines pitching in loosely enough to include speeches, one-time donations, and showing up after the difficult parts had been handled. When I tried, once, to explain to him that we needed written board procedures if the program was going to keep growing, he waved a hand and said, not everything needs to be formalized, Nora. Some things survive because people trust each other. That sentence stayed with me because it explained almost every Mercer family problem in one line. Trust, in our house, was not a mutual practice. It was a demand placed most heavily on the people already carrying the most risk. My mother understood that better than he did, though she did not always say so aloud. She signed forms when I put them in front of her. She kept receipts in labeled envelopes. She let me build donor logs and volunteer calendars and backup copies of almost everything. Then she would go into the town and charm people into believing the whole thing ran on faith and goodwill. We made a strange pair that way. She brought the room. I built the scaffolding. When she got sick, that division became even sharper. It started with fatigue, then tests, then more tests, then the word ovarian said in a doctor's office so gently it felt insulting. By the time we reached stage and treatment plans, the reading program had already become large enough that no one person could truly claim to hold it alone. But in practice, that was what happened. My mother could no longer stand for 2 hours at a literacy fair smiling at donors. She could not drive across county lines for every meeting. She could not charm volunteers through schedule changes while sitting in chemotherapy with a blanket over her knees. So I took over more. Not publicly at first. I flew in for board meetings, reworked budgets, covered a part-time coordinator's wages one winter when a promised grant came in late, quietly paid the insurance renewal 2 different years because the fund balance had dipped below what anyone felt comfortable announcing. I did those things from Nashville because by then, my job put me in the exact sort of world Halcyon distrusted foundations: development offices, program reporting, donor cultivation, emergency bridge funding. In other words, the world of keeping idealism alive after the first warm article and the last easy check. Caleb, meanwhile, remained the local face. He was not useless. That would be unfair, and unfairness is just another way of making bad stories easier to tell. He attended board breakfasts, knew the school superintendent, helped with book drives, read aloud at 2 Saturday sessions every fall. But he was seasonal in the way many beloved sons are seasonal, present when presence felt good, diffuse when maintenance got repetitive. My mother knew the difference. I know she did, because during her second round of chemo, when I was at her house sorting donor receipts at the kitchen table, she said without looking up from her tea, "If anything ever happens to me, they'll turn this into symbolism before they turn it into stewardship." I asked what she meant. She gave me that familiar sideways glance that meant I was not going to get the answer all at once. "I mean," she said, "that some people love what work says about them more than they love the work." That sentence became the center of everything later. At the time, I thought she meant the town. I did not yet understand she also meant our family. By the last 6 months of her illness, the reading program had become one of the only things my mother could still speak about without sounding tired. It was where she still sounded like herself. She knew the names of the younger kids, knew whose mother had lost a job, knew which fifth grader kept pretending he hated reading because admitting he struggled would have embarrassed him in front of cousins. She loved the work honestly. That was what made what happened afterwards so bitter. The program was not a vanity project. It was the cleanest expression of her values I had ever seen. And the night of Caleb's campaign dinner, with my mother's photographs arranged as emotional decoration behind his event banner, I understood that my father had not simply decided to insult me, he had decided to repurpose her life. What he had not accounted for was that my mother had seen that possibility before any of us did. And unlike him, she had left paperwork. People in Halcyon liked to talk about me as if I had left and become abstract. Nashville girl, foundation work, grant writing, city life. They said those things in a tone that suggested I now lived somewhere, made entirely of glass buildings, catered lunches, and opinions no one back home had requested. The truth was less flattering and much more useful. I built a career in nonprofit program operations, which meant budgets, deadlines, emergency donor calls, staff turnover, compliance reports, and the particular kind of calm required when good missions are about to fail because the numbers don't love them back quickly enough. It was exactly the kind of work the reading program needed once my mother got sick. That irony would have been funny if my family had ever truly seen it. My first job in Nashville paid just enough to keep me in a one-bedroom apartment with unreliable heat and a laundromat 2 blocks away. I learned to track every expense. I learned how many meals could come from one rotisserie chicken and a pot of rice. I learned that the phrase mission-driven often means underfunded and overworked. Over the years, I moved up, first into program coordination, then development operations, then the kind of role where people called me only when they wanted impossible things made quietly possible by Friday. That work changed me, but not in the ways my father liked to imply. It did not make me arrogant. It made me exact. It did not make me detached. It made me harder to soothe with vague intentions. I learned how small organizations fail, rarely because people don't care. Usually because the same 2 or 3 capable women carry too much for too long, while everyone else praises the mission from a manageable distance. I learned that donor trust depends on boring things, clear records, renewal calendars, reconciled statements, backup plans. I learned that people who call structure cold are often people who have never been left holding the consequences of someone else's disorder. That knowledge followed me back to Halcyon every time I helped my mother with the reading program. At first, it was simple. I cleaned up budgets, created board packets, rewrote donor letters so they sounded less like church announcements and more like actual stewardship. Then the work deepened. The year donations fell short after a tornado season hurt half the county. I covered a staff gap through my own account and marked it as a short-term bridge so the after-school coordinator would not lose her paycheck before Christmas. The year the insurance renewal increased unexpectedly, I paid the difference and told my mother We could sort reimbursement when the spring fundraiser cleared. We never did. The year the copier broke and the county office said they could not help, I ordered a used one from a church in Clarksville and paid freight because the alternative was letting the summer reading packets collapse into chaos 2 weeks before launch. None of that felt heroic. It felt like maintenance. That was the problem with invisible labor. It never looks like sacrifice while you're doing it. It just looks like the next thing that would fail if you didn't step in. My mother knew. She always knew. Sometimes she would call late at night, halfway through a donor spreadsheet or after a board meeting had gone off course, and say, "I hope you understand that I know what this costs you." I would say, "It's fine." She would say, "No, it isn't. That's why I'm naming it." No one else in the family ever did. My father liked to tell people Caleb was carrying the mantle more and more as my mother weakened. Caleb never corrected him. That was one of the ways I knew my brother's decency had limits. He was not a liar by instinct. He was simply willing to live inside flattering inaccuracies if they arrived wrapped in enough local affection. There were board meetings where he spoke as though he understood the annual budget when I had built it, donor lunches where he shook hands with people I had briefed him about the night before, church breakfasts where people congratulated him on the program's growth, while I stood beside the coffee urn explaining volunteer schedules to the librarian. He did not shove me aside. He just let the current move around him in ways that benefited him and cost me. Family harm often works exactly like that, less through aggression than through consent to imbalance. By the time my mother entered hospice, I had covered enough small gaps in the program to know exactly how fragile the whole thing really was. Not morally, operationally. One delayed renewal, one weak fundraiser, one missing grant report, and the same town that praised literacy on Sundays would start asking whether the program had maybe simply run its course. My mother knew that too. That was why, in the last year of her life, she started keeping more written notes than usual, not diaries. Not sentimental reflections, operational notes, donor names, restriction conditions, which local promises could be trusted and which needed confirmation in writing. She became more exact as she grew sicker, not less. People around her mistook this for anxiety. I recognized it for what it was, stewardship. And somewhere in those same months, without telling my father or Caleb, she began making a second kind of record. Not of the program, of the family around it. Who came for meetings? Who came for visibility? Who showed up after chemo when no one was watching? Who offered concern? Who offered labor? I did not know the extent of that record yet. All I knew on the night of Caleb's campaign dinner was that my father had chosen the worst possible room to imply I was a distant opportunist because the program only still existed in present tense, partly because I had been, carrying pieces of it from 50 miles away for years, and my mother had known exactly how easy it would be for that truth to vanish if no one formalized it. That was why she had left the packet. That was why the retired treasurer was standing now with a gray binder in her hands. And that was why, for the first time that evening, my brother had stopped pretending the room would settle itself without cost. When my mother moved from treatment into hospice, the town became kinder in public and less useful in private. That is not bitterness speaking. It is simply the ratio I observed. People brought casseroles. People sent cards. People stopped my father in the hardware store and squeezed his arm with the solemn gratitude reserved for men briefly adjacent to female suffering. The reading program board sent flowers. The church made a prayer list. Women who had not volunteered in years suddenly remembered to call and say how much June had meant to the children. What did not happen as often was this: insurance forms filled out on time, meal schedules coordinated sensibly, medication changes tracked accurately, volunteer communication handled without duplication, or any meaningful reduction in the administrative burden that gathers around a dying person and the work she can no longer physically supervise. So I came home more. At first, every other weekend. Then nearly every weekend. Then midweek when a hospice nurse called and said my mother was having more pain, or my father sounded overwhelmed, or the program's fall donor mailing still had not gone out, and no one could tell me whether the printer had even preces. Received the updated file. My mother hated needing help in visible ways. She could tolerate exhaustion better than dependence. Even in hospice, she still asked about volunteer rosters, donor acknowledgments, and whether the elementary school had confirmed its spring reading challenge dates. The body was failing, but the part of her that held structure remained fiercely awake. That was what frightened me most, if I'm honest. Not her decline, her lucidity inside it. She saw exactly what was being lost and exactly who was trying to narrate around that loss instead of meeting it. My father's version of caregiving was loyalty in appearance. He slept in his own recliner because the bed didn't feel right anymore. He told people he was with her every day, which was true. What he meant by with, however, was not what hospice meant by with. He could sit in the room for an hour and never notice which medication had been moved to the wrong tray, or that the humidifier water needed replacing, or that the volunteer coordinator had sent the same donor list twice because nobody had updated the shared file. He was not heartless. He was simply a man who had spent most of his life being praised for presence, when presence was the least difficult part of the equation. Caleb was kinder than our father and less disciplined than the work required. He came by after church, lifted heavy things, charmed the nurses, and did exactly the sort of visible tasks families remember fondly later. He could make my mother laugh even when she was tired. He could carry in groceries, tighten a porch rail, and leave everyone feeling steadier. What he did not do was stay late enough to see what happened when the laughing stopped and the details remained. That was my place. It had become my place so gradually that by winter it hardly felt assigned anymore. It felt structural. I was the one hospice called when dosages changed. The one the librarian called when the reading program's audit file was missing 2 receipts and 1 donor acknowledgement letter. The one who knew where the spare key was, which folder held the grant restrictions, and how long my mother could sit upright before her back pain increased. My mother noticed the difference between care and commentary more sharply as she weakened. One February afternoon, after I had spent an hour on hold correcting a bank transfer issue tied to the program's account, she asked me to bring her the blue legal pad from the side table. I sat on the edge of the bed while she wrote, slowly, line by line, pausing between words when the morphine made her hand feel far away. "What are you writing?" I asked. "An irritation," she said. That was how she talked when something mattered enough that sentiment would only get in the way. A week later, she asked me to drive her to the library after hours. The retired treasurer, Evelyn Strickland, was waiting inside. Evelyn had spent 20 years working at the local bank before taking over the library board's books after retirement. She was not warm in the performative Southern way and had never once mistaken friendliness for trust. I liked her immediately when I was 22 because she asked for reconciliations instead of reassurance. My father disliked her for the same reason. That evening, after my mother sat down in the back office with a blanket over her knees, Evelyn set a gray binder on the table and said, "June wants this held off-site if the program is ever used for anything other than the program." My father was not in the room. Neither was Caleb. That detail mattered. "What exactly does that mean?" I asked. My mother gave me one of those looks that meant I was not going to get a full answer yet. "It means drift," she said. "And drift needs paper before it needs argument." Inside the binder were board minutes, donor restrictions, reimbursement records, emergency bridge transfers, copies of checks, updated bylaws, and a sealed packet clipped inside the front cover. The packet had my mother's signature across the seal and a note in Evelyn's handwriting beneath it, to be opened only if the literacy fund is politicized, repurposed, or misrepresented for family advantage. I looked at my mother. She did not look back. She was too busy watching Evelyn lock the binder in the file cabinet by the copier. That was when I first understood she was not merely trying to keep the program solvent after her death. She was trying to protect it from us. Not from me, from the family system around it. From the natural temptation to take a respected woman's public work and turn it into symbolic capital for the nearest charming man once she was gone. I wanted to ask more. Instead, I drove her home in silence. That spring, when the campaign dinner was announced, and I saw my mother's program sliding under Caleb's name in committee emails and donor invitations, I knew exactly what kind of drift she had meant. What I did not know was whether Evelyn would actually bring the binder into a room full of Mercers and church people and public money. As my father stood smiling under the campaign banner and the retired treasurer rose with gray cardboard in her hands, I got my answer. The first time I realized Caleb was not simply being flattered into the wrong story but actively cooperating with it was 2 weeks before the campaign dinner. A donor invitation draft had been forwarded to me by mistake. That was how these things often happened in families like mine, not through confession, but through administrative carelessness. Somebody hit reply all when they meant to forward privately. Somebody left the wrong board packet in the volunteer inbox. Somebody assumed Nora was no longer close enough to the machinery to notice what language had changed. The subject line read, "Final copy for April 14 kickoff dinner." Inside, under Caleb's campaign photo, the third paragraph described him as continuing the educational legacy started in his own home through his mother's literacy initiative. Then, 2 lines later, it said the campaign would protect and expand the kind of reading access Caleb has personally championed for years in Halcyon County. I read that sentence 3 times. Not because it was technically untrue Caleb had volunteered. He had shown up. He had read to children and carried boxes and shaken hands at events. But there is a difference between participating in a thing and becoming its rightful heir. There is a difference between helping sometimes and being the person who kept the book straight, covered the shortfalls, negotiated the renewals, and sat with the founder while she decided how the work should survive her. He knew that. So did my father. Which meant the sentence was not careless. It was strategic. I called Caleb that night. He answered on the 3rd ring, sounding distracted and irritated in the way people do when they suspect the conversation already has edges. "Hey," he said, "everything okay? I got the dinner draft by mistake." A pause. Then, "Which draft?" I almost laughed. "The one that turns Mom's program into your campaign biography." Another pause. Longer this time. "Nora, it's just event language." "No," I said. "It's ownership language." He exhaled sharply. "You're making this bigger than it is." That sentence is one of the oldest weapons in my family. It sounds like perspective. Usually it means inconvenience. I told him the wording needed to change, that honoring our mother's work was one thing, folding it into his campaign image as if he had carried it was another. He said, "No one's erasing you," which told me immediately that he knew exactly what I was naming. Then he added, "But you don't live here, and people have seen me doing the work." There it was. Not cruelty, not even a lie in the cleanest sense. Just the social math he had let himself believe. Visible work counted more than sustaining work. Public presence outweighed remote stewardship. The son in the room becomes the face of the labor the daughter helped keep alive from 50 miles away. I said, "People saw you reading picture books on Saturdays." They did not see grant reconciliations, payroll, bridge transfers, audit prep, or the insurance renewals I covered. His voice cooled. And whose choice was it to live in Nashville all those years? I stood in my kitchen staring at the dish rack while he said it, feeling the old family structure settle into place around us without either of us having to name it. Leaving had always been treated as my moral complication, no matter what I did from outside. Distance itself was evidence. It did not matter whether I sent money, drafted reports, fixed broken systems, or came home on weekends while my mother was dying. I had left. Therefore, anything I did later could be framed as partial, inconvenient, emotionally suspect. Mom knew exactly what I did, I said. Caleb was silent for a moment. Then he said, "This dinner is about the future, Nora. Maybe let it be that." That was when I understood the campaign event was not simply adjacent to my mother's memory. It was feeding on it. And if I let the wording stand, if I stayed home or came quietly and endured the speeches, the drift my mother warned about would become record. I told Caleb I was coming. He said, "Do whatever you think you need to do." In our family, that sentence rarely meant freedom. It meant, if you object, you'll be blamed for the discomfort your objection causes. The week after that call, 3 more things happened. First, the board secretary who had ignored me twice about missing reimbursement forms in the past sent a stiff email saying all historical program matters should now go through Caleb's campaign liaison to avoid confusion. Campaign liaison for a children's reading program. That alone told me how far the repurposing had already gone. Second, my father left me a voicemail saying, it would be a shame to bring old tensions into a room meant to support the schools. He did not mention the draft language. He did not need to. My father's favorite skill was making boundaries sound selfish when they inconvenienced a larger image. Third, Evelyn Strickland called. She said only, "I assume you saw the invitation." I said yes. Then she asked, "Are you coming?" Again, just yes. After a pause, she said, "Good, so am I." That call steadied me more than I wanted to admit. Not because Evelyn was sentimental, she wasn't, but because she was one of the few people alive who had watched my mother move from generosity into caution and understood that those two states were not opposites, they were phases of stewardship. By the time the dinner arrived, I knew the room would not be neutral. I knew my father would try to frame me before anything specific could be discussed. I knew Caleb would let him. And I knew that if the gray binder came into the hall at all, it would not arrive as spectacle. It would arrive the way all serious corrections do. Quietly, with dates, with signatures, with enough structure to make charm feel flimsy. What I did not know was whether I was ready for the emotional cost of hearing my own family choose image over accuracy in front of donors, teachers, church people, and women who had once praised my mother's stubbornness when it served their children. When my father raised his glass and suggested I had come home for an audience, I got my answer. I was ready enough. And so, apparently, was Evelyn Strickland. The campaign dinner was not the first time my family suggested I was difficult around the program. It was just the first time they had enough local witnesses, enough emotional staging, and enough social confidence to say it with a microphone nearby. Before that, the work had been done through atmosphere. That is how reputation assassination usually functions in real families, not through one dramatic smear, through accumulation, through enough small descriptions repeated often enough that by the time someone says something pointed in public, the room has already been trained to absorb it as plausible. By the spring after my mother died, I could feel the shift in almost every conversation connected to Halcyon. At the grocery store, women who used to ask whether I needed anything for June began asking whether I was still very involved with all that library business. At church, people I had grown up with started complimenting Caleb's steady hand before I had heard from him directly about any of the actual board decisions being made. At the bank, an assistant manager I barely knew said, "I suppose after living in Nashville so long, it must feel strange seeing local work handled a little differently." That sentence stayed with me because it contained the entire strategy. Distance makes your labor look theoretical. Local people get to define reality. If you push back, you sound territorial. If you stay quiet, the record drifts. My father never once called me greedy. He was too careful for that. Laurel never called me dishonest. She preferred implication. Caleb never said I had not helped. He only spoke as if my help belonged to the past, while his presence represented the living future of the program. That was what made the whole campaign apparatus so dangerous. It did not need to lie outright. It only needed to redistribute emphasis. Caleb in photos. Caleb in donor calls. Caleb at church breakfasts talking about continuing June's work. Me, meanwhile, was described in ways that sounded harmless until you laid them side by side. Nora still has strong feelings. Nora sees things in terms of systems. Nora means well, but she has always had a hard time letting local people lead. That last one came from Laurel. I know because two separate people repeated it to me in slightly different words, which is how family language spreads in small towns. Someone says a sentence at the right table, someone else retells it after adding concern, and by the third version, it becomes social common sense. I tried, briefly, to correct the record one person at a time. That was my mistake. I sent a factual email to the board, asking that all donor communications distinguish clearly between the Literacy Fund and Caleb's campaign committee. I requested updated copies of the board minutes from the last 3 meetings since I had missed one during a grant cycle in Nashville. I reminded the secretary that I had covered the coordinator payroll shortfall 2 winters earlier and still had not seen that reimbursement properly reflected in the annual summary. The replies were polite. That was the problem. Polite delay, polite vagueness, polite suggestions that timing might not be ideal. One email from the board secretary read, "Given current community sensitivities, we may want to avoid language that sounds divisive." Divisive, in this case, meant accurate enough to disturb a useful impression. My father called after that. His voice on the phone had the same quality it would later have at the podium patient, burdened, faintly disappointed. "Nora," he said, "you have to understand that people around here are tired. They want something hopeful after what happened to your mother." "Caleb's offering that, and accuracy threatens hope?" I asked. "No," he said, "but tone does. Tone." There it was again. Always tone. In our family, facts rarely got debated directly. Instead, the moral conversation shifted to delivery. If I named a discrepancy, someone said I sounded sharp. If I requested records, I sounded controlling. If I objected to my mother's work being folded into a campaign storyline, I sounded bitter. By the time my actual point came up, the room was already busy discussing my emotional weather instead. That technique works because it lets everyone avoid the labor of answering. I said, "This isn't about tone. It is if you want people to hear you," my father replied. "No," I said. "It's about whether Mom's program is a public good or a family asset." He was quiet after that. Then he said, "Be careful not to make yourself the issue." That was the warning. Not angry, not explicit, but clear. If I objected too visibly, I would be recast as unstable, territorial, emotional, resentful of Caleb's visibility, resentful of the town, resentful of having left. The old family machinery was already humming beneath the surface. All it needed was a room. That room became the campaign dinner, and by the time I walked in, carrying nothing more aggressive than a neutral face and the decision not to let my mother's work become a prop without at least naming what I saw, reputation had already done half the speaking for them. The audience did not need to hear, "Nora is selfish." They had heard enough softer versions for months. They had heard, "Nora is intense. Nora is very invested. Nora struggles to let go. Nora doesn't always understand how things work here." Once those sentences settle, a father only has to stand at a podium and suggest his daughter enjoys attention for the room to do the rest. That was why the binder mattered. Not because it would create drama, because it would do the one thing reputation cannot survive well once it gets used to floating free. It would pin time down. By the time my father raised his glass and made the room laugh softly at my expense, the event had already stopped being a campaign dinner in any honest sense. It had become a sorting mechanism, not for policy, not for the school board race, not even for my brother's future. It had become a way to test who in that room would choose image over sequence once the two came into conflict. That is what family humiliation often is in public spaces. It is not only punishment, it is rehearsal, a way of teaching everyone present which version of events will be rewarded socially and which one will cost too much to support out loud. My father did not point at me. He did not raise his voice. He simply smiled into the room with his glass still in hand and said, "I suppose we should also welcome people who only come home when there's an audience." Then he looked directly at me. Nora's always had a gift for timing. A few people laughed because they thought they were being asked to share a harmless family joke. That was the danger. The sentence had been built to sound light enough that objecting to it would make me seem humorless, thin-skinned, or self-important. That is how the best humiliations work in respectable rooms. They arrive wearing the face of banter while carrying the weight of accusation. I stayed seated for 1 second longer than felt natural, partly because I could feel the room watching, and partly because I understood that if I moved too fast, half the people there would stop hearing my words and start evaluating my expression. Nashville made her sensitive. Success went to her head. She could never just let things be. Those sentences had not been spoken yet that night, but they were already alive in the room. I knew how family reputations worked. They did not need to be repeated constantly to remain available. I stood. The chair legs scraped lightly across the floor. A woman near the desserts shifted her weight. One of the literacy board members lowered her eyes. Caleb finally looked up from his plate, which would have meant more to me if he had looked up 30 seconds earlier. My father's smile did not disappear. It only narrowed. That was his talent. He could make confrontation look like he was simply enduring someone else's unnecessary intensity. "I didn't come here for an audience," I said. "I came because this room is using Mom's work, and I wasn't going to learn about that from a flyer." The sentence landed more sharply than I intended, but I do not regret it. Sometimes clarity sounds aggressive only because the people hearing it had counted on a softer lie. My father set his glass down beside the podium. "No one is using anything," he said. "This campaign is about education. Your brother has given years to these children." There it was. Not false enough to cleanly refute. Just incomplete in the exact places that mattered. Caleb had given time. He had shown up publicly. He had helped. The trouble was not that he had done nothing. The trouble was that the room was being led to believe the reading program and his candidacy belonged to one continuous moral story, as if his visibility had naturally grown out of my mother's labor and not partly out of the quiet administrative work I had been carrying from outside the county for years. That is how takeover happens in families with good manners. Not through erasing every fact, through selecting only the flattering ones. I looked at Caleb then, not my father. "If this is only about education," I said, "why is Mom's program folded into your donor packet?" His face changed, not dramatically, but enough. A tightening at the jaw, a flicker of annoyance before he reassembled it into something blandly public. "This isn't the time," he said. That sentence almost made me laugh. Rooms always become the wrong time the moment they stop protecting the person who arrived with social advantage. My father stepped in before I could answer. "Nora," he said, "you've always had trouble separating your feelings from the larger picture." That was one of his old lines, updated for public use. Not angry, not crude, just paternal enough to invite agreement from people who liked men to sound patient with difficult women. I could feel the room divide along invisible lines. The retired principal near the back had stopped pretending to drink her coffee. Marcia Wynne, the campaign chair, was straightening pledge cards that no one had touched in 5 minutes. 2 deacons by the side wall were staring at the banner instead of the speakers. Coach Michael Devlin, who had read aloud at the literacy program every summer since his own daughter learned to sound out words, there was watching my father with the expression of a man trying to decide whether neutrality had just become cowardice. That was when Evelyn Strickland stood. She did not rise dramatically. She simply pushed her chair back, lifted the grade binder from the table beside her, and said, in the voice she used for bank errors and budget meetings, "Before this continues any further, I think the room should hear June Mercer's final board instruction." The entire hall shifted, not because people knew what she meant, because the tone changed instantly. A family dispute can still be dismissed as emotion. A board instruction cannot. Especially not from Evelyn, who had spent 20 years in local banking and another 6 keeping the reading program's books clean enough that even the town's worst gossips trusted the annual numbers. My father looked at her as if he had been struck by an object too small to anticipate. "Evelyn," he said, smiling again. But this time the smile was carrying effort. "I'm not sure this is the place." She did not smile back. June disagreed. That sentence broke something open in the room. Because now the issue was no longer whether I was overreacting or whether my father's remarks had been unfairly interpreted. The issue had become sequence. June Mercer had apparently left an instruction. Evelyn had apparently brought it. And my father, who had just invoked legacy, continuity, family sacrifice, and local service, now had to decide whether he wanted to be the man who prevented June's own written direction from being heard in a room decorated with her photographs. He knew it. I knew he knew it. So did Caleb. For the first time all evening, my brother looked less like a candidate and more like a son caught between admiration and consequence. "What instruction?" Marcia Wynne asked, too quickly. Evelyn opened the binder, slid a sealed packet free from the inside cover, and held it up just enough for the nearest tables to see my mother's signature across the flap. "An instruction to the literacy board," she said, "to be read if the program was ever used for political association, family positioning, or public misrepresentation after her death." No one spoke. The church kitchen hummed faintly from the back corridor. Ice settled in paper cups. Somewhere outside, tires passed on wet pavement. My father said, "That sounds like a private board matter." Evelyn looked at him over the top edge of her glasses. "It might have stayed one," she said. "If tonight had." That was the cleanest sentence anyone had spoken all evening. And it worked because it did not accuse beyond what the room had just seen. No spectacle, no exaggerated moral language, just sequence again. The event had crossed a line. Therefore, the instruction became relevant. Structure had entered. Family tone was no longer enough. I did not speak. That mattered too. The temptation in moments like that is always to rush in and explain yourself, to claim the opening and fill it with all the clarity you have been denied. But I knew this room. If I became the main voice again, the whole thing would tilt back toward personality, toward tone, toward whether Nora from Nashville was making things bigger than they needed to be. So I stayed silent and let the structure do its work. Evelyn handed the sealed packet to Coach Devlin. "Would you witness the opening?" she asked. He stood immediately. That was when I knew the room had truly changed. Not because everyone agreed with me, because 2 people with local credibility had now chosen procedure over comfort in full view of everyone else. My father did not sit down, but some of the certainty went out of his shoulders. Caleb looked from the packet to the photo display of our mother and then away again, as if he finally understood that whatever happened next would not fit inside campaign language. Evelyn broke the seal, and for the first time that night, the room was not waiting to hear what my family said about me. It was waiting to hear what my mother had said about them. Evelyn did not rush. That was the first thing that steadied me. In rooms built on social pressure, speed usually favors the person with the microphone, the practiced smile, and the family story everyone already knows how to repeat. Slowing the room down changes the balance. It forces people to sit with sequence instead of instinct. It asks them to hear words in the order they were written, rather than the order most useful to whoever got there first. Coach Devlin stood beside Evelyn while she unfolded the packet. My father remained near the podium with one hand resting on the table edge, not because he needed support, but because he had spent his whole life learning how to make himself look steady in rooms where steadiness passed for innocence. Caleb was no longer touching his plate. His campaign cards sat in neat stacks by the dessert table, looking suddenly childish and overprinted. Evelyn adjusted her glasses and said, "This is a written instruction from June Mercer to the Literacy Board, dated February 17th, signed in my presence and in the presence of Laura Kim, Library Director." No one interrupted. That mattered. Even before the letter was read, the room had shifted from family tension into something more procedural. The moment witness names entered the air, people's bodies changed, chairs straightened. Conversations ceased entirely. Marcia Wynne, who had spent all evening arranging pledge cards and donor napkins like good presentation could still save the moral texture of the night, sat down without meaning to. My father's favorite kind of authority, social, familiar, lightly paternal, was already being asked to compete with a different kind. Records, dates, other adults who had signed things. Evelyn began. If this instruction is being read, then the Mercer Family Reading Fund has been placed in a public setting where my name, my work, or my program is being used in a way that blurs stewardship with family image. If that has happened, the board is to remember immediately that the fund was created for children, not for legacy theater. No gasp, no dramatic murmur. Just the sound of the old church refrigeration unit kicking on in the kitchen behind the hall. That was one of the things I loved most about my mother's writing when she allowed herself to be exact. She did not overreach. She did not accuse more than she could support. She chose phrases that opened a room and let shame do its own work. Legacy theater. Not theft. Not betrayal. Not corruption. Just a phrase sharp enough to expose performance without making the room defensive too early. Evelyn continued. My son Caleb has volunteered meaningfully at points over the years, and that should be named honestly. What should not happen is the conversion of intermittent, visible service into the appearance of continuous stewardship. Those are not the same thing. That line changed Caleb's face. Not because it destroyed him. It did not. That was part of what made it powerful. My mother was not disowning him. She was distinguishing between public help and sustained responsibility. She was naming proportion. And proportion was exactly what the room had been denied all evening. For months, the town had been fed a clean emotional narrative. Mother dies, son steps up, campaign grows naturally from family service. It was elegant, flattering, and mostly false in the ways that matter most through omission. Evelyn turned the page. If Nora is being described as distant, opportunistic, controlling, or overly invested in the fund, the board is instructed to review the enclosed financial and administrative ledger before permitting any further public framing of her role. Her labor was often remote because my illness made remote labor necessary. Distance did not equal absence. In several years, distance was what kept the fund solvent. I did not realize until then how tightly I had been holding my shoulders. They softened all at once, not into relief exactly, but into recognition. My mother had not merely loved me. She had understood the exact shape of the lie that would later be told. She knew they would weaponize geography. She knew Nashville would be treated as moral evidence. She knew a daughter working 50 miles away could be framed as detached, even while carrying the administrative load that local people preferred not to count, because counting would embarrass them. That understanding hurt more than comforted at first, because it meant she had been preparing for her own family to do exactly what they were doing now. Evelyn paused long enough to remove a second set of documents, clipped behind the instruction. I'm going to read the summary page first, she said. My father finally spoke. Evelyn, I'm not sure this is appropriate at a campaign dinner. He sounded careful, not angry. That was the best he could do now. Appropriateness is what people reach for when accuracy has become dangerous. Evelyn looked up at him and said, June considered that possibility when she wrote it. Then she read, Attached are donor restrictions, emergency bridge transfer records, reimbursement delays, insurance renewal payments, and board attendance summaries from the past 4 fiscal years. If there is any confusion regarding who sustained what, let the ledger resolve what memory will not. That sentence landed harder than anything before it. Not because the room understood every financial term, because everyone understood the phrase, let the ledger resolve what memory will not. That was the whole family, condensed into one line. Memory in our house had never been neutral. It moved according to comfort. It softened men. It beautified intermittent effort. It turned women's labor into atmosphere. It loved symbols and distrusted detail. My mother, sick enough to know she was dying, had apparently decided that memory was not safe enough to leave alone. The documents themselves were not theatrical. That was their strength. Copies of checks, board attendance logs, a 1-page summary of emergency transfers made to cover staff wages when grant money was delayed, insurance payment records for the Literacy Fund's program liability policy, including 2 years where the premium shortfall had been covered through a personal reimbursement, later waived by donor correction. My name appeared on those pages more than Caleb's did, not because he had done nothing, because the work had not belonged to one category, and he had been standing in the visible parts while I had been carrying the hidden ones. Coach Devlin took the summary sheet from Evelyn and read one line aloud without being asked. December 14 payroll bridge transfer, $4,200, privately advanced by Nora Mercer to avoid coordinator lapse before year-end appeal cleared. He looked at Caleb then, not cruelly, just directly. You knew about this? Caleb swallowed once before answering. I knew she'd helped. Helped? That word almost broke something in me. Not because it was wrong, because it was so small. Small enough to protect him. Small enough to turn 4 years of operational rescue into something casual, feminine, optional. My mother had known this would happen too. There was one final paragraph in the instruction. Evelyn read it last. The reading fund was never a family heirloom. It was a public trust. Anyone who speaks of it as legacy should first show what they carried when carrying was dull, repetitive, and invisible. If they cannot, let them use my name less. No one moved after that. Not my father. Not Marcia Wynne. Not the deacons. Not the women who had spent the last month praising Caleb's continued devotion. My mother had not accused them of crimes. She had done something far more destabilizing. She had named scale, named labor, named the difference between image and maintenance. And once those distinctions entered the room, my father's earlier remark about my gift for timing no longer sounded witty or paternal. It sounded like what it had always been, an attempt to get there first. The dinner had begun as a campaign event. By that point, it had become something else entirely. A room in which my mother, from beyond it, had forced everyone present to decide whether they respected public service enough to stop confusing it with family performance. And the worst part for the wrong people was that she had done it without spectacle. No hidden recording. No surprise arrest. No screaming confrontation. Just records. Which meant no one in that room could dismiss the correction as drama. They had to sit with it as structure. And structure is much harder to insult than a daughter. What happened next was not a scene. That mattered. If someone had shouted, the room would have had an escape route. If I had stood up and told everyone exactly how many late-night donor calls I had made, how many board packets I had corrected, how many shortfalls I had patched with my own money while my mother was too sick to keep the whole machine standing, people would have heard emotion before they heard sequence. They would have called it understandable, then excessive, then unfortunate, and by next Sunday the town would have settled into a softer version of the same lie. But the ledger was different. The ledger had no pulse to attack. It had dates, transfers, attendance summaries, insurance renewal records, restricted donor notes, board reimbursement delays, all the dull, necessary architecture of a program people loved sentimentally and neglected operationally. That is why it changed the room more effectively than any speech I could have made. Coach Devlin was still holding the summary sheet. Evelyn had placed the rest of the documents on the front table beneath my mother's photographs, and the image was so precise it almost felt planned by something larger than any of us. June Mercer smiling beside a child holding a paperback, and directly below that smile, the paperwork that proved how hard she had worked to keep other adults from romanticizing what only systems could sustain. My father was the first to try to recover. "She's making this sound more formal than it was," he said. That line would have worked an hour earlier. It did not work now. Not because the room suddenly disliked him, but because the documents had changed the burden. Before the ledger, he could rely on tone. After the ledger, he needed specifics. And specifics were exactly what men like my father spend a lifetime avoiding whenever specifics might cost them authority. Evelyn said. It was formal enough for insurance, payroll, restricted giving, and annual reporting. That seems formal enough for me. No one laughed. Marcia Wynne stepped in then, and I could see from the way she straightened the stack of pledge cards again that she was looking for a way to save the evening without having to contradict the paperwork outright. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "we should separate the campaign piece from the literacy fund discussion." It was a smart sentence. Too late, but smart, because that was exactly what should have happened from the start. Had the dinner done that, my father would not have had to frame me. Caleb would not have had to sit under a banner built partly from my mother's memory, and the room would not now be discovering that legacy had been standing in for bookkeeping, negligence, and family self-flattery all along. My brother finally stood. That surprised me more than anything else that evening. Not because I thought he was cowardly, because I had spent so many years watching him survive through affability that I had nearly forgotten he was capable of feeling cornered in a useful way. He did not come toward me. He did not go to our father. He stood near his chair, one hand on the back of it, and said, "I didn't know about all of this." It was not enough, but it was true enough to matter. My father turned to him immediately, which told me he understood the greater danger now was not public embarrassment, but fracture. "Of course you didn't," he said. "This is exactly what I mean. People have a way of making support look like ownership." There it was again. The old strategy: shrink the labor into something vague. Make money sound emotional. Make continuity sound grabby when it comes from a daughter. I spoke then, not because I wanted the room back, but because by that point silence would have sounded like permission. "I never asked to own it," I said. "I asked that Mom's work not be folded into a campaign story that erased how it was actually held together." That sentence landed differently than it would have earlier, because now it rested on structure instead of grievance. The documents had already done the hard work of creating credibility. I was not introducing a claim. I was clarifying one. Caleb looked at me then and said, very quietly, "Why didn't you tell me it was that bad?" I almost answered with the truth, because every time I tried to tell the family anything operational, someone translated it into tone. Because that bad is exactly the threshold at which daughters become inconvenient. Because I had spent years preserving the fund, not rehearsing for a trial in a church hall. What I said instead was, "I thought Mom had." That hurt him. I saw it. Not the way public humiliation hurts, the way absence does when it finally acquires shape. My brother had not been malicious. That was part of the tragedy. He had been useful in the visible places and incurious in the invisible ones. He had let admiration fill in the blanks where stewardship should have asked questions. The room began rearranging itself after that. Not literally at first. Socially, two of the literacy board women moved from the back toward Evelyn and the binder. The retired principal asked, in a voice meant for business rather than comfort, whether the board had current copies of the donor restriction language. Marcia Wynne started taking down the extra campaign flyers nearest my mother's photo display. One of the deacons quietly removed the banner from behind the podium and folded it in half, as if even he understood that whatever the evening had been designed to sell, it could no longer borrow June Mercer's face to do it. That was the moment I knew the ledger had done its work, not because everyone agreed with me, because the room had begun operating according to sequence instead of family tone. My father saw it too. He did not apologize. He would not. Men like him almost never step directly into accountability when they can still attempt to outlast it, but the steadiness had gone out of him. For the first time in my life, I watched him stand in a public room and realized that his confidence no longer guaranteed obedience. He said, "Evelyn," replied, "then perhaps the next one should be." And that was the end of the campaign dinner. Not formally. No one dismissed the room. No one declared the event over. It simply lost the narrative engine that had been holding it together. People began moving in practical directions instead of symbolic ones. Chairs shifted. A volunteer unplugged the warming trays. Someone gathered untouched pledge cards. Conversations broke out in low, uneven pockets that had nothing to do with the speech and everything to do with recalculation. Public image had cracked. Now came the slower part. Paperwork, board votes, account consequences, and the question none of us could avoid anymore. What, exactly, had my mother known was coming when she entrusted that binder to Evelyn and wrote a line sharp enough to divide image from stewardship in one reading? The answer turned out to be more than any of us wanted to admit. And the first person it truly exposed was not my father, it was my brother. The week after the campaign dinner, Halcyon behaved the way small towns always behave after a respectable public crack appears in something people had mistaken for solid. No one called it a scandal. That would have sounded too exciting, too vulgar, too close to entertainment. Instead, people said things like, "Well, I'm sure there was more going on than we realized," and "June always was particular about details," and "campaign timing probably complicated things." Those sentences did what small-town language is designed to do. They turned a moral disruption into a manageable social draft, something to walk around without naming too directly. But the documents had already done something language could not undo. They had changed the burden of explanation. Before the dinner, if I said the literacy fund was being blurred into Caleb's campaign and my mother's work was being repackaged as family branding, I sounded intense. After the dinner, anyone who wanted to keep repeating the old story had to do so in conscious conflict with records, board instructions, transfer histories, and named witnesses. That doesn't make people honest. It makes them quieter. The literacy board met the following Tuesday in the library back room, where the program had begun years earlier. Same folding tables, same cheap fluorescent light, same low shelf of chapter books with worn spines and crooked labels my mother used to straighten while talking to volunteers. I was there. So were Evelyn, the retired principal, the library director, Marcia Wynne, and Caleb. My father was not. That, by itself, told me everything. He understood this was no longer a room where presence helped him. The board voted on 3 things that evening. First, that the literacy fund and any political campaign activity had to be fully separated in all current and future communications. Second, that the financial records from the previous 4 years would be reviewed and formally corrected where informal bridging support had been used without proper public accounting. Third, that my mother's board instruction and the supporting ledger would be entered into the permanent governance file. No one used the word apology. Again, that mattered, because apology would have let the room become emotional. Governance made it procedural. Procedure was exactly what my mother had trusted more than sentiment by the end. Caleb looked sick through most of that meeting. Not because anyone attacked him. No one did. The retired principal asked 2 hard questions. Evelyn asked 3 sharper ones. Marcia tried twice to suggest that everyone had been operating under strain. But no one called him selfish or accused him of plotting anything sinister. That would have been inaccurate, and inaccuracy was the very thing I had spent years choking on. What the board did make plain was this. He had allowed himself to be treated as steward-in-chief of a program whose hidden maintenance he had not bothered to understand. He had accepted a flattering narrative because it arrived in his father's voice, because it fit the town's preference for visible sons, and because asking whether it was proportionate would have forced him into the kind of self-scrutiny charm rarely demands. After the meeting, he asked if we could talk outside. We stood near the library's side entrance beneath a flickering security light, while the evening air smelled faintly of river damp and cut grass. He said, "I really didn't know the full picture." I believed him. That was the trouble. Believing him did not reduce the cost. "You knew enough to ask better questions," I said. He looked down. "That's fair. There are moments when you can feel the difference between remorse and inconvenience. This was remorse, or the beginning of it. Not complete, not eloquent, but real enough that I didn't need to crush it for my own satisfaction." He said, "Dad told me you wanted control." I almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was so old. Control. The family word for any woman who names structure before a man gets to name tone. What I wanted, I said, was for Mom's work to be treated as a public trust, not a campaign atmosphere. He nodded slowly. Then he asked, "Do you hate me?" That question was so much younger than the rest of the evening that it nearly undid me. "No," I said, "but I don't trust what you don't ask." That stayed with him. I could see it. As for my father, he retreated into the sort of silence men like him mistake for dignity. He did not call, he did not apologize. He told 2 people at church that the dinner had become more administrative than expected, which was such a precise form of self-protective understatement that I almost respected it. Almost. The town adjusted in the way towns do. Some people became aggressively kind, which is one form of guilt. Others avoided me for a while because exactness makes comfortable people feel exposed even when it is directed elsewhere. A local banker who had praised Caleb at the fundraiser sent me a note saying he had not been aware of the full continuity of stewardship. That sentence was clumsy but useful. Continuity of stewardship. Better than help, better than support, closer to scale. The biggest shift, though, happened inside me. I stopped arguing with soft lies. That was new. For most of my adult life, I had still believed the right clarification, delivered in the right tone, at the right time, to the right person, could repair enough misunderstanding to keep relationships morally intact. After the dinner, after the board vote, after hearing my mother's language enter the official record, I understood that some people do not misunderstand you because the facts are unclear. They misunderstand you because your accuracy costs them comfort. Once you see that clearly, your energy changes shape. You stop pleading. You start naming. And because you stop pleading, the people who depended on your confusion often get quieter, not because they've become better, but because structure has taken away their favorite escape route. My mother had known that. That was why she left paper instead of speeches. That was why she trusted Evelyn instead of the family. And that was why, a month later, when my father finally came to my door with something in his hands and no prepared expression on his face, I already knew the conversation would not be about forgiveness. It would be about whether he had any language left besides the old one. My father came to see me in May carrying a banker's box. That detail matters because men like him do not usually arrive with containers unless they have decided that objects will speak more safely than they can. I was back in Nashville by then, in the brick townhouse I rented on a narrow street, lined with dogwoods and parallel parked SUVs. The literacy board had corrected the records, separated the campaign from the fund, and issued a revised public statement that was dry enough to be respectable and clear enough to matter. Caleb had withdrawn the continuing June's legacy language from all campaign materials and, to his credit, stopped using my mother's photographs at events. We had spoken twice since the library meeting. Both conversations were careful, honest in places, incomplete in others. That felt about right. My father had not called once. Then, on a Wednesday evening just after 6, I opened my front door and found him standing there holding a worn cardboard file box with both hands. He looked older than he had at the campaign dinner. Not broken, not dramatically changed, just less arranged. As if certainty, once it stops functioning as protection, ages a man faster than time does. "I was in the city for inventory," he said. "Thought I should bring these." I stepped aside and let him in because some conversations become smaller and uglier if you force them to happen on a porch. He set the banker's box on my dining table. Inside were old reading program files from my mother's home office that had been stored in his garage after her death. Volunteer rosters, early donor postcards, supply receipts, handwritten planning lists, 2 photo albums, and the original notebook where she had drafted the very first summer reading schedule in pencil before formal forms existed. He had labeled the folders with masking tape in his own handwriting. That more than anything told me he had not come to perform humility. He had come because he had finally done some sorting. "Evelyn said these ought to be with the board archive or with you," he said. "Not with me because I deserved them. Not because he wanted me to have them. Just ought." The old language still clung to him, even now. I made coffee. We sat at the table. For a while, neither of us opened the box. "Finally," he said, "I told myself for a long time that I was protecting your mother's name." I waited. Then he added, "What I was really protecting was a version of the family that made me feel less late to things than I was." That was not a perfect sentence. That was why I believed it. Perfection is how people like my father hide. Imperfect honesty is usually the only real kind they have. He looked at the box instead of at me. "I thought if Caleb stood up and carried it publicly, that would count for what your mother built. I thought people needed something simple. I didn't think hard enough about who had been carrying what where. That last, where mattered. Not just who had done the labor, where the labor had been done from. From Nashville, from spreadsheets and bridge transfers and donor calls and long drives home. From a life the town had always treated as morally suspicious because it was not located within county lines." I said, "You didn't think because the simpler story favored you." He nodded once. "Yes." That was the first fully useful conversation we had ever had. Not because it solved anything, because it stopped pretending. He did not ask me to forgive him. That also mattered. Too many apologies are built around extraction. They ask the harmed person to produce relief quickly enough that the person who failed can stop sitting in the wrongness. My father did not do that. He sat in the discomfort and let it remain his. We talked for almost an hour. Not warmly, not cruelly, like 2 adults finally discussing a structure one of them had spent decades mistaking for order. I told him that what happened at the dinner was not only about one remark. It was about years of my work being translated into temperament, while Caleb's visibility was translated into stewardship. It was about the family trusting sons with narrative and daughters with maintenance. It was about distance being turned into moral suspicion when the distance in question had often been the very thing that made rescue possible. He listened. Once he said, "I didn't know how much you were covering." I answered, "You didn't want to know. Knowing would have required new language." That hit him. Good. Some truths are not cruel simply because they arrive without padding. When he left, he did not hug me. Neither of us reached for that. He stood at the door, holding his empty hands like a man surprised by how strange they looked once they were no longer carrying the wrong version of his own life. He said, "I can't fix the dinner." "No," I said. "But you can stop repeating it to yourself as if it was reasonable." Then he nodded and went downstairs. That was the shape of our peace. Not reconciliation in the storybook sense, Not estrangement either. A narrower thing. A door, not a restoration. I kept the banker's box. Some of its contents went to the literacy board archive after proper indexing. Some stayed with me. The 2 photo albums are on a shelf in my office now beside grant manuals and binders full of real work. My mother's first planning notebook lives in the drawer where I keep documents that matter enough to survive a house fire if I can get to only 1 box on the way out. People still ask sometimes what happened in Halcyon that spring. Not directly. Small towns prefer narrative samples, not depositions. I usually say this. My mother left better records than people expected, and the records made everyone use smaller words. That is true, and it contains almost everything worth saying. I did not win anything from that campaign dinner. I did not take the program. I did not expose a crime. I did not force public shame on people for sport. What happened was smaller, quieter, and in some ways more lasting. Scale was corrected. Labor was named. The family story lost its easiest false center, and I stopped negotiating with versions of me that only existed to make other people feel less accountable. That was enough. Maybe more than enough. Families like mine rarely implode in one spectacular moment. They drift. They redistribute credit. They let charm stand in for stewardship. They train daughters to feel guilty for precision and sons to feel noble for visible participation. Then, if someone finally names the imbalance, the system calls her difficult. My mother knew that before I did. That was why she left paper. Not because she mistrusted me, because she distrusted what families do to the truth when the truth threatens comfort, image, or inheritance of reputation. If I have learned anything worth keeping from all of it, it is this. You do not need to turn every betrayal into a war to refuse its version of you. Sometimes the strongest correction is structure. A signed instruction. A ledger. A witness no one can charm. A sentence precise enough to outlast family weather. My father implied I came home for attention. What I came home for, though I did not have the language for it yet, was proportion. My mother had built something real. My brother had helped, but not held. My father had translated image into ownership, and I had spent years carrying parts of the weight from far enough away that people could pretend not to see it. Once that was named, everything got smaller and truer. Caleb still serves on the school board. The reading fund still exists. The children still come in on Saturdays and leave with books under their arms. My father and I speak now every few weeks, usually about ordinary things. Weather, inventory, whether the tomatoes came in early. He does not overuse my mother's name anymore. That, for him, is a form of change. And me? I no longer mistake invisibility for irrelevance. I no longer confuse being misread with being wrong. And I no longer explain my labor to people whose comfort depends on calling it too much. That is not anger. That is peace with structure. And structure, I have learned, is one of the few things strong enough to survive both family love and family weather without changing its shape to flatter either one.